Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. I'm continuing my beginner's guide, and in this one, I want to try to help you figure out a class that's right for you. Just one thing to keep in mind is that, as the title says, this video is aimed for absolute beginners. So, I'll be going over a lot of the basics, and at the same time, I won't be too in-depth or technical as to not overload you with unnecessary information. This isn't a what's the best class for Legion video. I won't say which is the best for DPS, or the best healing, or tanking, so if that's what you're looking for, you're in the wrong place. This is just a very basic rundown / preview of the classes and what roles they're capable of. At the time this video was made, there are 12 classes total, so you have quite the selection to choose from. The only one you can't pick right from the get-go is the Demon Hunter. To make them, you need to be level 70 first. That's because they start off at a higher level and they don't want you skipping through the game on your first character. Before I go over the classes, I think it would be a good idea to go over the roles first. Like most other MMOs, there are 3 different roles that you can choose from, and that's damage, tanking, and healing. They're all pretty self-explanatory. Tanking focuses on bolstering your defenses and having enemies attack you and not your allies. Healers keep you and your allies alive, and damage of course focuses primarily on killing enemies. In a typical 5-man party setting, you always have 1 tank, 1 healer, and 3 DPS. Some classes are capable of 1, 2, or all 3 of these roles, and that's because every class has different styles of gameplay to choose from called specializations, or specs for short. These specs allow you to fine-tune your gameplay and alter how your class plays. For example, as a paladin, you have the Protection, Holy, and Retribution specializations. Protection is a tanking spec, and you use a one-hander and a shield. Retribution is a damaging spec, and you use big two-handers, and Holy is the healing specialization. You can switch between these at any point in the game in case you want to switch things up a bit or your group really needs a certain role, but not every class is capable of performing all 3 roles. You also have some classes such as the Mage, whose all 3 specializations focus on damage, and that's Fire, Frost, and Arcane. Maybe you feel like burning your enemies alive, or rather freezing them, or you want the classic wizard-like arcane spells. Now, this isn't an absolute here, but usually for fresh people, I recommend choosing damage as your first specialization. Typically, both healing and tanking have more responsibility than damage dealers. They set the pace of a dungeon run, and most of the time, if either of them dies, everyone dies. But if a DPS dies, you still have 2 more alive, so it's a little more forgiving in a group setting if you're still trying to learn the game. So, because of these reasons, generally people are more comfortable as having damage as their first spec. And then when they get a good feel of the game, they switch to tanking or healing and take on a little more responsibility. Ultimately though, the choice is up to you and you should play what you think you'll have the most fun doing. So, let's get into the actual class picking. I'll go over each class one by one, and on the top right hand side of the screen, I'll indicate what role they are. And once again, if you want to read up on the lore for these, I'll have a link in the description that you might want to check out. First up, we have the Druid. This class is a little special because it actually has 4 different specs that you can choose from as opposed from the standard 3. The Druid is in tune with nature, and he uses this power to destroy his foes and protect his allies. Each spec has the ability to shapeshift into different animal forms, a bear for tanking, a cat for mobility and damage, and much more. How useful these forms are though depends on your spec, as I'll explain in a bit. Guardian spec focuses on and empowers your bear form, giving it more abilities and added defense and threats so you can mitigate damage more effectively. Restoration is the healing spec, which uses healing over time effects. These are buffs that you put on your allies that slowly heal them over time. They're typically instant cast spells, which gives them the advantage of being highly mobile. So, it makes it much easier for fights where there's a lot of fire or bad stuff that you have to move out of. Next up is Feral, which is a melee spec that makes your cat form more powerful. You have the ability to stealth and ambush your enemies, and the spec has a focus on bleeding effects where your abilities deal more damage or give you other benefits if your target is afflicted with a bleed. And lastly, they have the balance spec. This one is a little weird to explain, but you basically use the powers of the moon and the sun in balance with each other. Also, your form is a giant chicken thing. Once again, I'll have links to the lore for these classes in the description, but this spec has a good mix of damage over time effects and highly damaging but long cast time spells. So, overall, the Druid is a really good choice if you want to try a little bit of everything. Next, we have the Hunter. This is a pure DPS class, once again meaning that all 3 specs are damage focused. The Hunter is accompanied by a beast companion, and you fight together either as ranged or melee depending on your spec. This class is special because you can choose any beast companion in the game to be your ally. You have a taming skill, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of different types of animals in the game for you to choose from. They make for a very good solo class because their pet can act as a tank for them, and the hunter has a skill that heals his pet, so it's kinda like a 3-in-1 package if you're solo. But if you're in a dungeon or raid setting, you're going to want to leave the healing and the tanking to other people. So, first up we have the marksmanship spec. This spec focuses on improving the hunter's ranged attacks, making them even more deadly from a distance. The beast mastery spec improves your pet's damage and abilities, and even gives you an additional temporary pet summon. Think of this as the Ace Ventura spec. And lastly we have the survival spec, which is a melee specialization. This excels at using traps, poisons, and bleeds, and it puts you in the thick of it alongside your beast companion. Overall, the hunter is a really good class for solo play, and it's a popular choice for beginner players because of that. Next, we have the mage. I think everyone knows the deal with this class. This is the classic wizard archetype that you see in every RPG game. Once again, a pure DPS class with 3 specs: Fire, Frost, and Arcane. Fire spec is a good choice if you want to burn your enemies alive. Lots of fire spells to scorch, cinder, and cook your enemies to death. Frost is pretty self-explanatory as well. For this spec, you have a wide array of icy attacks, frost bolts, blizzards, and even a water elemental pet to assist you. And Arcane spec uses the more classic wizardry spells. Arcane missiles, barrages, and explosions. Now you're really playing with power. You also have some nice perks with this class, such as the ability to teleport yourself and others to the various major hubs in the game. Very useful for getting where you need to go. And you can also conjure food and drinks for people to restore their health and mana. It's always good to have at least one mage in the group. Class number 4 on our list is the monk. This is another class that can fit any of the 3 roles: damage, tanking, or healing. The tanking spec is the brewmaster. This spec mixes drinks and concoctions together to give them special abilities, and the brewmaster specifically uses those abilities to protect their allies from harm. They kind of have a drunken master theme going on. They even throw kegs of beer at their enemies. Mistweaver is their healing spec, and they concoct herbal medicine to heal their allies. They also use melee attacks to increase the effect of their healing spells, so they're a little more aggressive compared to some of the other healing specs who just stand in the back the whole time. And lastly, Windwalker is the DPS spec. You're the Kung Fu master with this one, and you can use a variety of unarmed techniques. Martial arts stuff basically. It's a very agile and mobile spec that uses a large variety of quick attacks. Next up we have the Paladin, which I briefly went over earlier. You can think of these guys or gals as warriors of light. They wear heavy plate armor, making them quite tanky regardless of the spec. Their actual tank spec though is called Protection, and they use a mix of heavy defense through a shield and the power of the light to protect themselves and their allies. Holy is full on healing, and you call upon the divine to aid your allies. Their heals are quite potent, and having the ability to wear plate armor makes them one of the toughest in the game. And finally, Retribution is the damaging spec. For this spec, instead of using your holy power to solely heal or protect your allies, you use it to smite your enemies, along with a giant two-handed weapon of course. It's a mix of melee and holy damage, and at the same time you do have some spells and effects that benefit your allies. Once again, another nice jack-of-all-trades class, and it's a good choice if you feel like you might change your mind about your role as you play the game. The Priest is next on our list with 1 DPS spec and 2 healing specs. Holy is a healing spec, and a very versatile one at that. They have solid single target and AoE heals, I'd say more aimed towards single target. They're the most conventional healing spec I think. They're not as mobile as druids, as tanky as paladins, or as combat inclined as Mistweaver monks. They're just a very solid, classic healer that relies on reactive gameplay. Discipline is also a healing spec, and it's unique in the sense that it's more focused on damage prevention. They have powerful absorb shields that can protect allies from danger, and the way they actually heal is also unique because they do it by dealing damage at the same time. This is really the closest you'll get to a hybrid spec these days. Of course their damage isn't as potent as a damage spec, but it's nothing to dismiss. And lastly, they have the Shadow specialization. Being the Masters of Light, they're also the Master of the Dark Arts, and they use a combination of slow damage over time effects and high single target bursts for their damage. They have a system where they generate a resource called Insanity, and then they use that to activate a powerful void form that increases their damage output by a huge margin. Overall, a very fun spec with a high skill cap I think. Next up is the Rogue. This is the thief archetype that you see in every RPG. Stealth, pickpocketing, ambushing, and backstabbing. It's another pure damage class with 3 different ways to dish it out. First, we have the Subtlety spec, which focuses on empowering your stealth and abilities used from stealth to decimate your enemies before they even know what hit them. You also have the more upfront Outlaw spec, which is more of a pirate swashbuckling style. You still have stealth, but this is a more in-your-face style of combat that combines swords and a pistol to give you the advantage. And lastly, we have the assassination spec. This is a dual-wielding dagger specialization that prefers a slow killing method through poisons and bleeds to cripple and debilitate your targets. The 8th class on our list is the Shaman. This class focuses on mastering the elements of the world, and you can call upon powerful elementals to aid you. 2 damage specs and 1 healing. Restoration, as you can probably guess, is for healing. They're pretty decent at everything healing-wise. They have good mobility, good AoE heals for small groups, and they're a little more tanky compared to the Priest and Druid because they can wear mail armor. Sort of a jack of all trades in the realm of healing. Enhancement is a melee spec that uses the elements to, well, enhance your weapons and give them powerful buffs. It's an in-your-face aggressive melee spec, and you have some spell effects to throw in the mix as well. And Elemental is more of a ranged caster that uses the raw elements themselves. Lightning, fire, earth, and frost spells are all at your disposal. Their toolkit has a ton of variety for just one spec. The whole class is a mixed bag, and they're pretty versatile overall. Anyways, the Warlock is next on our list. Think of these guys as mages, but rather than using the conventional fire, frost, and arcane magic, they prefer to delve into shadow magic and demons. They're another pure damage class, and they have 3 very different playstyles. Affliction spec uses a variety of damage over time effects to slowly chip and pick away at your enemies. Destruction harnesses the power of fire and chaos damage to deal slow but devastating attacks. It's a flexible specialization that can quickly burn down high priority targets at a moment's notice. And Demonology Warlocks have a variety of special demons to summon and empower so they can do the work for them. Demons aren't limited to just Demonology spec though. Every Warlock gets them, so they make for a really good solo class just like the Hunter. Next up we have the Warrior. This is probably the most common class out of any RPG ever made. Since the dawn of humankind, when our ancestors first discovered the killing power of rock and bone, blood has been spilled in the name of everything from God to justice to simple psychotic rage. And that's the Warrior's creed, rage. As an arms warrior, you're a master of weapons, and you use giant two-handed swords, axes, or maces as your tools for destruction. Protection warriors protect their allies from harm, and instead take up a bulwark to shield themselves from danger. A question you may have asked yourself is what's better than a giant two-handed axe? The answer is 2 giant two-handed axes. With their titanic grip, Fury Warriors wield any 2 of swords, axes, or maces at the same time to overpower and overwhelm their enemies. For these last 2 classes, I don't recommend them as your first character because they start off at a higher level. Like I said, the choice is ultimately up to you, but if you're new to the game and you want to get the basics down, the best place to start is from the beginning. So, the 10 I just went over would be the ideal choice for new players. The Death Knight is next on our list. These are an order of undead knights who have broken free from the Lich King's grasp and now seek revenge for the lives that were taken away from them. Bloodspec casts afflictions on their enemies and leeches life from them, gaining their attention and keeping themselves alive at the same time. Well, as alive as a Death Knight can be anyways. Frostspec calls upon the icy touch of the grave and dual wields one-handed weapons for their style of combat. They have a wide variety of physical attacks and frost spells at their disposal. And Unholy Spec spreads plague and raises the dead. He commands a small army of undead minions to do his bidding. And the last class left to talk about is the Demon Hunter. This is the newest class added to the game, and it does have a couple of requirements, at least at the time that this video was made. First is that it requires the Legion expansion, and you also need to have a level 70 character to even be able to make them, like I mentioned earlier. They're the disciples of the great Illidan Stormrage. They use a combination of fel and chaotic energy as their primary goal to rid the world of the Burning Legion. Havoc Spec uses their iconic dual glaive weapons. They're very mobile, probably the most mobile spec in the game, and they walk a fine line of harnessing fel magic as their weapon, granting them great power, but also making them susceptible to turning into the very demons that they seek to destroy. Vengeance takes on fire and pain as their weapons, gathering the attention of enemies and using dark magic to attack and harvest their souls while their allies take them out. And with that, that's a very brief explanation of every class currently available in the World of Warcraft as of the Legion expansion. It's a hard choice for sure. I hope this video gave you a good idea of the feel and general gist of each class, hopefully enough to narrow it down to a couple of choices at least. Whether you want to master the elements themselves, sneak through the shadows, charge your enemies head on, shapeshift into a predator, wield the powers of the arcane, or all of the above, just remember to have fun with it. In the next and probably final part, I'll be going over the controls, the beginning steps of the game, and some of the features you'll encounter early on in the leveling process. As always, I hope you found this video helpful, like it if you liked it, and thanks for watching. Peace.